The scorching Manila sun punished the asphalt as Mateo ran barefoot through the street. His small, dark feet jumped over the hot ground as if dancing on embers, while sweat dripped down his face marked by scars from a childhood in the slums of Tonda. He was only 10 years old, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who already knew too much about life's harshness. The San Agustin Cathedral stood imposingly against the blue sky, its white walls reflecting light like a beacon amid the city's chaos. Mateo had heard stories about the place where God lived, where people found peace, where perhaps, just perhaps, someone would look at him without the judgment he faced on the streets because of his dark skin and torn clothes. The bell rang 3 times, calling the faithful to Sunday celebration. Well-dressed families converged on the temple like an orderly, serene river. Mateo watched from afar, huddled in the shadow of a tree, gathering courage to approach. In his pockets, only a few coins found on the ground and a small wooden cross that his grandmother had carved before departing. When he finally advanced toward the entrance, his heart was beating so hard it seemed to want to escape from his chest. The line diminished and Mateo approached timidly, eyes fixed on the marble floor that shone like a mirror. That's when a wrinkled, heavy hand rested on his shoulder, stopping him like an anchor. "Not here," whispered the security guard in a dark suit, without even looking directly at the boy. "This is not a place for you." The words fell like stones, as Mateo was gently pushed away from the entrance, out of the circle of light emanating from inside the church. Outside, the sun seemed even more merciless, and the silence of rejection echoed louder than any word that could have been spoken. On the other side of the city, in the modest office of Caritas Philippines, Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle leafed through reports on marginalized communities. His fingers traveled over statistics and numbers that, for him, would never be just data. They were lives, faces, stories. On each page, he saw Manila's invisible ones, those whom the city swallowed daily in its race for progress. The old ceiling fan spun slowly, offering little relief from the heat. Drops of sweat formed on the cardinal's forehead as he removed his glasses to massage his temples. In his hands, calloused by time, the simple wooden rosary slid silently, a prayer for those who didn't even know someone was praying for them. Father Joaquin Reyes, his longtime assistant, entered the room carrying more folders and a cup of tea. "The children of Tonda still have no access to basic education," he commented, placing the documents on the table. The cardinal merely nodded, absorbing one more painful reality among the many he faced daily. That afternoon, Tagle decided to personally visit San Agustin Parish. Not as an ecclesiastical authority, not as a public figure, but as a pilgrim. He dressed simply, white shirt without a clerical collar, dark pants, shoes worn from use. He wanted to see with his own eyes, without the filter that his official presence always created. When the door of the small office closed behind him, the cardinal carried with him only his faith as a shield and an open heart as a compass. The sun began its descent on Manila's horizon, painting the sky with orange tones that reflected in the puddles on the streets. Where he was going, not even he knew for certain. He just followed the silent call that had always guided him through the labyrinths of human misery. Mateo remained seated on the concrete steps across the street, observing the church door like someone contemplating an inaccessible paradise. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since the day before, when Ms. Estrelita from the market had given him leftover fruits that were almost overripe. People continued to enter and leave the temple, some casting curious glances in his direction, others averting their eyes as if his misery were contagious. Dark clouds began to form in the sky, announcing one of Manila's sudden tropical storms. The first drops fell heavily, marking the dusty ground with dark circles that expanded like small universes. Mateo hugged his own knees, trying to make himself smaller under the narrow eave that barely protected him. The church security guard observed the boy from afar, his face an impenetrable mask of duty fulfilled. His name was Renato de Magiba, father of 3, a man who for 20 years had maintained order in God's house. His instructions were clear: keep beggars and street children away during celebrations, preserve the peace and decorum of the sacred place. The rain intensified, now falling in dense curtains that distorted the view of the city. Matteo trembled, not just from cold, but from a deep loneliness that seemed to consume his small body from within. The wooden cross in his pocket pressed against his leg, like a silent reminder of a promise made to his grandmother, that he would never lose faith, even when everything seemed lost. Meanwhile, a figure walked slowly in the rain, unhurried, without an umbrella, letting the water wash his face and thoughts. Cardinal Tagle advanced through Manila's streets like an anonymous pilgrim, his attentive eyes capturing details that many preferred to ignore: the beggar under the marquee, the elderly woman collecting cardboard, and now, the small silhouette huddled before the majestic San Agustin church. The rain had diminished to a fine drizzle when Cardinal Tagle approached the steps where Matteo was sheltering. There were no words initially, just the presence of a man who simply sat down beside the boy, equally wet from the rain, equally silent. Water ran down both their faces, mixing with tears that only one of them knew he was crying. Matteo cast a suspicious glance at the stranger. He didn't recognize in that simple man, with soaked clothes and grey hair stuck to his forehead, the figure of the cardinal he occasionally saw on posters and in newspapers. He saw only someone who, unlike everyone else that day, chose to sit beside him instead of passing by hurriedly. Tagle removed from his bag a small package, bread still warm, bought from a street vendor minutes before. Without words, he offered half to the boy, whose eyes widened at the unexpected gesture. The bread was divided as in a silent communion, each chewing slowly, feeling the warmth of the food contrast with the cold of the rain. The minutes passed, marked only by the sound of the city coming back to life after the storm. A skinny dog crossed the street, pausing briefly to look at the two before continuing on its way. Tagle smiled at Matteo, a smile that seemed to illuminate his face from within. Then, with simple gestures, he asked the boy's name, pointing to him and then to himself, saying only, "Luis." When Matteo finally spoke his name, his voice was hoarse from disuse. The cardinal nodded as if he had received precious information, and then pointed to the church, raising his eyebrows in a silent question. Matteo lowered his eyes, shame coloring his face as he shook his head negatively. It was then that Tagle stood up, extending his hand to the boy. An invitation, not an imposition. Together, they walked toward the church entrance. Matteo's small, rough hand disappeared in the cardinal's larger, equally calloused hand. Security guard Renato straightened up when he saw the two approaching, his confused gaze alternating between the dirty boy and the man he didn't immediately recognize as Cardinal Tagle, due to his simple, drenched clothes. "Good afternoon, my friend," said Tagle with a soft, firm voice that many recognized from sermons broadcast on the radio. Recognition hit Renato like lightning, his eyes widening as he realized who stood before him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out as the cardinal and the boy passed by him, entering the sacred space without ceremony. The cathedral's interior was a world of golden shadows and reverent silence. Candles flickered, creating dancing patterns on the secular walls, while the smell of incense hung in the air like a visible prayer. Matteo looked at everything with eyes wide with amazement, his breathing almost suspended before the beauty he had never imagined existed. Some faithful turned to observe the newcomers, expressions of surprise and discomfort crossing their faces as they saw the street boy being led through the church. A lady with bright jewels moved slightly away when they passed her pew, as if poverty could stain her expensive dress. The cardinal noticed each look, each gesture, absorbing everything without judgment, only with a deep sadness for what he witnessed. They reached the altar, where Tagle helped Matteo kneel. Together, in silence, they remained there, the prince of the church and the son of the streets, both bowed in prayer, both equally worthy under the merciful gaze of the crucified Christ that hovered above them. The boy's hands trembled as he removed from his pocket his small wooden cross, placing it timidly on the gleaming altar. The sacristan Amado Buenaventura, who had served in the cathedral for more than 4 decades, was the first to recognize the cardinal despite his simple, wet clothes. With hurried steps, he approached to offer towels and assistance, but stopped abruptly upon seeing Tagle's silent gesture asking him to keep his distance. The old sacristan understood and retreated, observing the scene with teary eyes. News of the cardinal's presence spread through the church corridors like wind through dry leaves. Father Martin Santos, the parish priest of San Agustin, emerged from his office hurriedly adjusting his vestments, preparing to receive the ecclesiastical authority. Upon arriving near the altar, however, the vision left him momentarily speechless. Tagle sitting on the marble floor beside Matteo, both observing the colored stained glass windows that filtered the evening light. The cardinal rose slowly and, with a simple gesture, invited Father Martin to join them. Disconcerted, the parish priest hesitated before awkwardly lowering himself, feeling the cold of the marble through his impeccable vestments. The three formed an unlikely picture: the street boy, the cardinal, and the priest, united in a silence that said more than any homily. Tagle then did something that would be engraved in the memory of all present. He removed his own pectoral cross, symbol of his authority as cardinal, and gently placed it in Matteo's hands. The golden metal shone against the boy's dark skin, who looked at the object with a mixture of amazement and reverence. It wasn't just a religious symbol changing hands, but a living message about the true meaning of the Church. The faithful who remained in the cathedral approached slowly, forming a silent circle around the scene. Among them was Renato, the security guard, his posture now different. Fallen shoulders, lowered eyes, like someone who suddenly sees the weight of his own actions. A solitary tear ran down his time-marked face as he watched the cardinal gently embrace the boy whom he himself had barred at the entrance. By the next morning, the story of Cardinal Tagle and the street boy was already circulating throughout Manila. Someone had photographed the moment with a cell phone, and the image, powerful in its simplicity, spread through social media like wildfire. It showed only 2 silhouettes against the colored stained glass: a man kneeling beside a child, both with their backs to the camera, united by the light that bathed them in celestial colors. In the small room at the back of the cathedral, where Tagle had taken Matteo after the rain, the boy slept deeply for the first time in months. Covered by clean sheets, his relaxed face seemed years younger, as if the weight of the world had been temporarily removed from his small shoulders. Beside the improvised bed, the cardinal's crucifix rested on an open Bible. Renato de Magiba had not slept. He had spent the night in vigil, tormented by the image of the boy he had rejected and by the cardinal's gaze. Not of disapproval, but of deep sadness, as if seeing through him to the core of his soul. When the sun rose, Renato was already standing before the cathedral door, not as security, but as a penitent, waiting for the opportunity to do what he knew was necessary. Father Martin met with the parish council in an extraordinary session. Voices rose in a heated debate about proper procedures and dangerous precedents. Some argued that opening the doors indiscriminately would bring problems. Others, touched by the cardinal's gesture, advocated immediate changes. That's when the door opened and Tagle entered silently, sitting at the back of the room, just listening, his tired but serene eyes observing the tumult his actions had unleashed. Meanwhile, in the slums of Tonda, something unexpected was happening. The news about Matteo and the cardinal had reached there, carried by the wind of conversations and second-hand smartphones. Barefoot children and elderly people bent by time began walking towards San Agustin Cathedral. It wasn't an organized procession nor a planned demonstration. It was a spontaneous movement of hope, as if an invisible door had been opened not just for one boy, but for all the forgotten ones of the city. Sunday's sun bathed Manila when the doors of San Agustin Cathedral opened completely. Not just the main doors, majestic in their colonial architecture, but also the side ones, the garden gates, every possible entrance to the sanctuary. And at each one, there were no uniformed security guards, but welcomers, volunteers who had responded to the silent call initiated days before. Renato de Magiba was there, no longer as a guardian who separates, but as a bridge that unites. His hands, previously ready to detain, now extended in welcome. By his side, Matteo smiled timidly, wearing simple but clean clothes, his eyes shining with something that had disappeared long ago: belonging. Together, they received well-dressed families and homeless people, businessmen and garbage collectors, all entering the same sacred space. At the altar, Cardinal Tagle prepared for the celebration. His official vestments contrasted with the simplicity of his gestures, as he personally arranged extra chairs to accommodate the unexpected crowd. The crucifix on his chest was new, simpler than the previous one, made of dark wood similar to the small cross that Matteo carried in his pocket. A silent exchange had occurred, symbols transformed into bridges between worlds. Voices rose in song when the celebration began. Not the usual trained choir, but an unlikely mixture of timbres and accents, some in tune, others not, united by the same melody. In the first rows, where the city's notables normally sat, there was now a diversity that reflected Manila's streets in all their human complexity. At the end, when the last chord from the organ dissipated in the cathedral's heights, the silence that followed carried the weight of transformation. No one needed to explain what had changed. It was in the exchanged glances, in the hesitant smiles, in the hands that touched each other crossing social abysses. The evening light filtered through the stained glass, painting everyone with the same colors: Matteo, Renato, Cardinal Tagle, the rich, the poor. While outside, Manila continued its eternal dance of contrasts, perhaps a little more aware of its own cracks through which light insists on entering. If you enjoyed this story, leave your like and subscribe to our channel.